My name is Naomi Carter. I turned 36 on September 22nd, though for most of that day, it felt like my birthday belonged to everyone except me. The morning began, the way too many of my mornings had begun in the last few years, in silence. No balloons, no voicemail, no text lighting up my screen with a cheerful little heart or a badly chosen cake emoji. Just the low hum of my refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock above the stove, and a weak stripe of sunlight stretching across my kitchen counter like it had somewhere better to be. I told myself not to be childish about it. People get busy. Adults forget dates. Life moves fast. That was the lie I had learned to wrap around disappointment so it wouldn't cut as deep. By 8:30, I was dressed for work, hair pinned back, coffee gone cold in a travel mug beside me, still checking my phone every few minutes like a fool. Nothing from my mother. Nothing from my younger sister, Chloe. Not even one of those dry, last-minute messages people send when they remember, because social media reminded them. I got a birthday text from my dental office. I got one from the pharmacy. I got one from a furniture store I hadn't shopped at in 3 years. But not from my own family. By lunchtime, the ache had turned into something heavier. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just familiar. Like an old bruise pressed in exactly the same place again. I sat in my office parking lot with a salad I barely touched and stared at the family group chat on my phone. The last message in it was from Chloe 3 days earlier, a mirror selfie with a caption about final dress fittings for her engagement party. My mother had responded within seconds with a row of heart emojis and a comment about how radiant her baby girl looked. I had read the exchange then, smiled at the screen like I was supposed to, and said nothing. That was how it always worked, Chloe announced. Mom adored. I watched from the edge of the frame. By the time I got home that evening, the house felt too quiet to bear. I kicked off my shoes, set my purse on the table, and stood in the kitchen without turning on the lights. The windows had gone dark. The sink was empty. On the counter sat a small bakery cupcake I had bought for myself on the way home. Vanilla with pale pink frosting, the kind a little girl might pick out for a real celebration. I'd even bought a single candle. It was still in the plastic sleeve beside the box, unopened. At 8:17 p.m., I finally picked up my phone. I opened the family chat and stared at the blinking cursor for a long time. I didn't want to sound needy. I didn't want to sound angry. I wanted, absurdly, to give them one last easy chance to be decent. So I typed, "I know everyone's busy, but today is my birthday." I looked at the sentence before sending it. It seemed so small, so harmless. Not an accusation, not a guilt trip, just the truth. I hit send and watched it appear beneath Chloe's dress photo and my mother's string of red hearts. 2 read receipts popped up almost immediately. They had both seen it. I waited. A minute passed, then 3, then 7. I set the phone down, picked it back up, walked to the sink, came back, checked it again. Nothing. The silence became its own kind of answer. And still I stayed there, leaning against the counter, telling myself maybe they were typing, maybe they were calling, maybe they were ashamed, and trying to find the right words. At 8:34, my phone buzzed in my hand. My mother's name appeared on the screen. For one stupid, hopeful second, my chest lifted. I opened the message. "Naomi, we need more peace in our lives. Don't contact me or Chloe anymore." That was it. No explanation. No softening. Before I could even process it, another little notification appeared beneath her text. Chloe loved the message. A red heart. Bright. Casual. Effortless. My sister had endorsed my erasure with the tap of a thumb. I didn't cry. That's the part people never understand when pain goes too deep. Sometimes it doesn't come out as tears. Sometimes it comes out as stillness. I stood there in my dark kitchen with my phone in one hand and that untouched cupcake in the other room, and I felt something inside me go cold and perfectly clear. There are wounds you can explain away. There are insults you can forgive, because maybe someone was tired, maybe someone misspoke, maybe they didn't mean it the way it landed. But this was different. This was deliberate. And somewhere between that unread candle and the little red heart under my mother's message, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had finally pushed me past the line. The message stayed on my screen, long after the kitchen had gone dark. Naomi, we need more peace in our lives. Don't contact me or Chloe anymore. I read it once, then again, then one more time, slower, as if the words might change if I looked at them hard enough. They didn't. Underneath it was Chloe's reaction, that small red heart glowing on the screen like something cruel could still be casual. I set my phone face down on the counter and stood there in the dark, listening to the refrigerator hum and the clock above the stove tick through the rest of my birthday. I didn't touch the cupcake I'd bought for myself on the way home. I didn't sleep much either. Every time I drifted off, I woke up with the same sentence pressing against my chest. By the time the clock crept toward 5, I gave up. I pulled on a cardigan, went barefoot into the kitchen, and switched on the small lamp over the sink instead of the overhead light. The room came into view, in a soft amber glow. The unopened candle still lay beside the bakery box. That was the part that got me somehow, not because it was tragic, but because it was so small. Such a tiny, stupid thing to be left untouched. And still, standing there, it felt like proof of something I had been trying not to name for years. I reached for my coffee mug, then stopped and looked at the framed photo near the refrigerator instead. My grandfather, Walter Hayes, stood in front of the first duplex he ever bought, one hand on his hip, squinting into the sun. He had trusted paper more than promises, numbers more than speeches. When I was younger, I used to think that made him hard. As I got older, I understood it made him accurate. I rested my fingers on the edge of the frame for a moment longer than I meant to. Then I pulled the laptop toward me and opened it. The screen lit the kitchen in pale blue. I logged into the Family Trust portal the same way I had on the first business day of every month for nearly 8 years. It was muscle memory by now. Rental income, property reserves, maintenance expenses, tax holding account, then the tab that mattered most. Beneficiary distributions. 2 names appeared on the screen. Elaine Carter, recurring monthly distribution, $5,200. Chloe Carter, recurring monthly distribution, $3,650. I stared at those numbers for a long moment. That money had never just appeared. It had never fallen from the sky, and it had never moved on its own. Every month, I had reviewed the accounts, checked the cash flow, and approved those transfers myself. Mortgage cushion, car payment, utilities, salon appointments, online shopping. The polished version of life my mother and sister showed the world was built on signatures they never had to think about because I did the thinking for them. Outside this house, people saw my mother as composed and self-sufficient. They saw Chloe as young, glowing, settled into a life that seemed easy and deserved. They did not see the gate behind that comfort. I did. My cursor moved to my mother's line first. For a second, a voice inside me tried one last weak defense. Maybe wait, maybe cool down, maybe don't do this while it still hurts. But then the message came back exactly as written, clean and deliberate. She hadn't lashed out in anger. She had chosen her words, sent them, and gone to bed. Chloe had seen them and agreed. I clicked on the recurring transfer. A box appeared in the center of the screen. Suspend future disbursements? I looked at it for all of 2 seconds. Then I clicked yes. The status changed from active to suspended. That was all. No shaking hands. No rush of panic. No dramatic release. Just one word disappearing and another taking its place. I moved to Chloe's account. Same box. Same question. Again, I clicked yes. Her status changed too. For a moment, I just sat there, both hands resting flat on the counter, my reflection faint in the window over the sink. I hadn't drained the trust. I hadn't destroyed anything. The properties were still there. The money was still there. My grandfather's legacy was still intact. I had only closed access to it. And the strangest part was how calm I felt once I did. Not happy, not vindictive, just quiet inside. As if some machine had been running in the background of my life for years and had finally been switched off. I closed the laptop and slid the unopened candle into the junk drawer. Then I poured a fresh cup of coffee and stood by the sink as the first thin light of morning began to creep across the street outside. The kitchen was still silent, but for the first time in a very long time, the silence didn't feel like rejection. It felt like control. By the time I locked my front door behind me, the sky had gone from black to that washed-out gray that comes just before sunrise. Once the decision was made, there was nothing left to do but keep moving. I carried my travel mug to the car, slid behind the wheel, and drove to the office with the radio off. At the first stoplight on Miller Avenue, my phone lit up with a trust notification confirming the suspensions had been processed. I glanced at it once, set the phone back down, and kept driving. The town looked the same as it always did in late September. Mrs. Donnelly was dragging her trash bin back toward her garage. A landscaper's truck sat outside the corner pharmacy. The bakery on Main had just turned on its front sign. Nothing about the morning suggested that anything in my life had shifted, but under that ordinary surface, something had finally moved into place. My office sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, in a 2-story brick building with faded green shutters and a narrow glass door that still read Hayes Property Services in gold lettering. My grandfather's name, my grandfather's building, my grandfather's life's work, handed to me in pieces so practical that most people never would have called it a legacy at all. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and keyed in the alarm code. The familiar beep sounded, then silence. The office smelled like printer toner, old paper, and floor cleaner. I set my bag on my desk, flipped on the front lights, and checked the message machine the way I always did. 2 tenant calls had come in overnight. One about a leaking sink on Birch Lane. One about a porch light out at the duplex on Madison. I wrote both down on the yellow pad beside the phone before I even took off my coat. Habit. Routine. The kind that keeps things standing. Only then did I look up. On the far wall hung the same framed photograph that had been there for years. My grandfather, Walter Hayes, in work boots and a canvas jacket, leaning against the hood of his truck with a smile that never looked fully relaxed. He wasn't a sentimental man. He believed in clean books, paid invoices, and fixing problems before they got expensive. When people in town talked about him now, they liked to use words like generous and respected. Those were true enough, but the word that fit him best was careful. That was what he had built, not some grand empire. Just 3 rental houses, 2 duplexes, 1 commercial storefront, and a trust strong enough to keep all of it healthy if the person running it knew what they were doing. Which meant, by the time I was 28, I knew exactly where every property tax bill landed, which furnace was overdue for replacement, and which tenants always mailed rent on the last legal day. I remembered the morning after his funeral almost as clearly as the text my mother had sent the night before. I had been sitting in Martin Bell's office, still wearing black, my hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold before I took 3 sips. Martin was my grandfather's attorney, a quiet man with silver hair and a voice that never rose unless it had to. He laid the trust papers flat on the desk between us and went through them 1 page at a time. "Your mother and sister are discretionary beneficiaries," he had said. "And you are the trustee." At 28, I thought that sounded simpler than it was. I thought it meant I would just help when help was needed. I didn't yet understand how much weight lived inside a word like discretionary. Martin made sure I understood before I left his office that day. Every distribution had to be reviewed. Every transfer had to be approved. The trust was meant to preserve the assets first, protect the family second, and never become a bottomless account for people who confuse support with entitlement. My mother cried all through that meeting. Real tears, or convincing ones. With Elaine, it was sometimes hard to tell. She kept dabbing at her face and saying she was too overwhelmed to think about legal details. Chloe, who was 24 then, sat stiff in her chair, staring at the paperwork like it had personally offended her. She asked only one question before we left. So when do the payments start? Not how this works. Not what Grandpa wanted. Not what I would need. Just when the money would begin. I should have understood more from that moment than I did. Instead, I told myself grief makes people strange. I told myself Mom was scared. I told myself Chloe was young, and for a while, maybe all of that was true. So I approved the first monthly distribution for my mother, when she said the mortgage felt too heavy after the divorce. I approved money for Chloe when she bounced from job to job and apartment to apartment, always one crisis away from needing rescue. Then came the extras. A transmission repair. A security deposit. An emergency dental bill. A short-term gap that turned into another month. Then another. I kept signing because I thought I was holding the family together. But standing in my office that morning, with the overnight maintenance notes under my hand and my grandfather's photograph on the wall, I could finally see what I had refused to name for years. The trust had not turned my mother and sister into selfish people. It had only made their selfishness easier to hide. My money management had not created peace. It had created padding, a softer place for other people to land while I disappeared beneath them. I sat down at my desk, opened the work orders on my computer, and stared at the screen for a second before the words came back into focus. The money had never been the foundation of our family. It had only been covering the cracks. That morning, I tried to work as if nothing inside me had shifted. I returned the call from Birch Lane about the leaking sink. I emailed our plumber. I logged the porch light repair for the Madison duplex. I opened a roofing estimate, read the first paragraph twice, and realized I had no memory of either pass. My hands were doing the job. My mind was somewhere else, still circling the same thought I had carried with me from the kitchen to the office. Maybe I had not betrayed my grandfather at all. Maybe I had only stopped betraying myself. I pushed back from my desk, opened the lower file drawer, and reached for the vendor folder I needed. My fingers brushed against a different file instead, an old blue one shoved flat beneath a stack of maintenance records. I paused. I knew that folder. The tab was bent at one corner, and across the front, in my grandfather's thick block handwriting, were two words I had not let myself look at in a long time. Trust. Personal. For a second, I almost shoved it back and closed the drawer. But I didn't. I pulled it out and laid it on the desk. Inside were copies of the original trust summary, old notes from Martin Bell's office, and a single yellow legal pad sheet folded in half. The paper had softened with age. I touched it carefully before unfolding it, already knowing what it was before I saw the handwriting. Martin had written the words down, but they had come from my grandfather. I was back in the hospice room before I even finished reading the first line. It had been late October, cold enough that everyone who came in carried the chill with them. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and peppermint lotion. A television was on somewhere down the hall, low enough that it sounded more like static than voices. My grandfather had hated hospitals, hated how everything in them felt temporary, but by then there had been no use pretending he was going home again. I had been standing near the window, arms folded tight across myself, watching a nurse wheel a cart through the parking lot below. I remember trying not to cry because he noticed everything, even then, especially then. "Naomi," he said. His voice was thinner than it used to be, but it still had weight in it. I went to the bed and bent down so he wouldn't have to raise his voice. He studied my face for a second. That was how he always looked at people when he wanted the truth before they had decided whether to offer it. Then he said, very quietly, "You don't have to make excuses for people just because you love them." I didn't answer. I think some part of me already knew where he was going, and I didn't want to hear it said out loud. He shifted slightly against the pillow and glanced toward the folder on the tray table beside him, the one Martin had brought earlier that afternoon. "Your mother has weaknesses," he said, "and Chloe has never been made to carry her own weight for long." It was gentler than the version I had remembered over the years. Less sharp, but somehow harder to ignore. I looked down at the blanket over his legs, at his hand resting on top of it, the skin pale and almost transparent. "They're grieving too," I said. A tired smile touched one corner of his mouth. That may be true, he said. It can also be true that grief doesn't change what people are made of. It just strips the polish off. I remember swallowing hard after that, because I wanted to defend them, and I wanted to believe him, and those two things would not sit in the same place inside me. He reached out then, and I took his hand. Listen carefully, he said. Helping someone is supposed to move them forward. If all it does is let them stay exactly as they are, it stops being help. That line stayed with me. It came back to me in strange moments over the years when I approved another transfer. I knew I should question more closely when Chloe called sounding irritated instead of grateful, when my mother spoke about the trust, as if it were weather instead of work. Each time, I heard his voice, and each time I softened it before I let it land. I told myself he meant to be careful, not strict. Generous, not firm. I translated his warning into something easier to live with. Then, that day in hospice, he tightened his fingers around mine and gave me the sentence I had carried ever since. Take care of them if you can, he said, but take care of yourself first. For years, I had lived inside the first half of that instruction. It made me feel dutiful, loyal, necessary. I had repeated it to myself every time I signed a check I should have held back. Every time I let silence stand in for gratitude. Every time I mistook endurance for love. But sitting at my desk that morning, with the old paper open in my hands, I finally saw the part I had spent 8 years ignoring. He had not asked me to protect them from every consequence. He had not asked me to fund selfishness until it turned cruel. He had asked me to use judgment. The office was quiet around me. Somewhere in the front room, the printer clicked and settled again. A car passed outside. I looked down at the page one more time, then folded it carefully along the same crease and placed it back in the folder. For 8 years, I had honored the part of his words that asked me to give. That morning, for the first time, I understood that shutting off the money was how I finally honored the part that asked me to stop disappearing. I sat there for another moment after putting the folder away, my hand still resting on the edge of the desk. The office was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak from the old building settling around me. Outside, the town had fully woken up. A truck rolled past. Someone laughed on the sidewalk. Life kept moving with that same rude steadiness it always had, as if nothing had changed. But something had. I turned back to my computer, looked at the open work order on the screen, and knew I wasn't going to read another word until I did one more thing. I had already made the decision. I had already suspended the payments. This wasn't about asking permission after the fact. It was about hearing, clearly and out loud, exactly where I stood before the fallout started. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Martin Bell's number. Martin had handled my grandfather's legal work for as long as I could remember. He had drafted the trust, amended it when the properties expanded, and sat across from me after the funeral explaining words I had been too numb to absorb the first time. He was not a dramatic man. He never filled silence just to make people comfortable. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. He answered on the third ring. Martin Bell. It's Naomi. His voice softened just slightly. Naomi, what do you need? I looked through the glass of my office door toward the empty front desk. I need to confirm something. All right, I took a breath. If I suspend the discretionary distributions from the trust, am I within my authority? There was no hesitation. Yes, he said, you are. I felt my shoulders loosen, but only a little. The trust gives you sole discretion over those payments, he continued. That means you can approve them, reduce them, delay them, or stop them, depending on what you believe is appropriate for the trust and the beneficiaries. I leaned back in my chair. Even after all this time? Yes, he said again. Sending the money for years doesn't turn it into a legal guarantee. Not under this document. That landed exactly where I needed it to. On my monitor, the trust dashboard was still open. 2 names. 2 statuses changed from active to suspended. Cold words on a screen. But now they looked less like a reaction, and more like a decision I had every right to make. I already paused them this morning, I said. There was a brief silence on the line. Not shocked, just attentive. Then I'm guessing something happened, Martin said. I stared down at the legal pad on my desk, at the notes I'd made from the tenant calls that morning. Birch Lane, Madison Duplex, normal problems. Problems that made sense. My mother texted me last night, I said. She told me not to contact her or Chloe anymore. Chloe reacted to the message like she agreed with it. It was my birthday. Martin didn't rush to fill the silence after that. Then he said, quietly, I'm sorry, Naomi. It was such a simple sentence. No performance in it. No exaggerated pity. Just recognition. Somehow that made it hit harder. I swallowed. I just need to know they can't force me to reverse it. They can be angry, he said. They can call me. They can call the bank. They can threaten to challenge it if they want. But a discretionary beneficiary cannot simply demand payment because they're used to receiving it. That's not how your grandfather set this up. And if they say I'm doing this because I'm hurt? Martin let out a small breath. Being hurt doesn't cancel out your legal role. The question is whether you're acting within your authority and whether the trust allows this choice. It does. I looked toward the wall, where my grandfather's photograph hung above the filing cabinet. So I'm not crossing a line. No, Martin said. You're doing what the document allows the trustee to do. Honestly, Naomi, if you have reason to believe the money is no longer being handled responsibly, or that continuing as before serves no constructive purpose, you're supposed to evaluate that. That's part of the job. Part of the job. For years, I had treated that role like it was mostly about endurance. Absorb the tension. Keep things smooth. Sign the checks. Avoid the fight. Hearing Martin say it that way stripped all of that softness off the truth. My responsibility had never been to keep everyone comfortable. It had been to exercise judgment. I should have done that sooner, I said. Maybe, he answered, but sooner isn't available. Now is. I let that sit for a second. Then I asked the question I hadn't realized I was carrying until it was already out of my mouth. Did my grandfather ever say anything to you about this? About a day like this? Martin was quiet long enough that I knew he was choosing his words carefully. He told me once, he said, that there might come a time when you'd have to make a hard call for the sake of the trust and for your own sake. He wanted you reminded, if that day came, that the trust was written to support that decision. My throat tightened. I pressed my thumb against the edge of the phone and stared at the screen without seeing it. Naomi, Martin said, his voice steady as ever, you're on firm ground here. I closed my eyes for just a second. When I opened them again, the office looked the same desk, the same files, the same old building, but something in me had settled. Not relief exactly. Relief was too soft a word for it. It was steadiness. Thank you, I said. After we hung up, I set the phone down and looked once more at the trust dashboard on my computer. The words hadn't changed. Elaine Carter suspended, Chloe Carter suspended, but they no longer felt like the sharp edge of a fresh wound. They felt like the beginning of consequences. And for the first time since my mother's message the night before, I wasn't waiting to see whether I had done something terrible. I knew I hadn't. October 1st came 4 days after my birthday, right on schedule. By noon, the money still hadn't reached their accounts. I didn't know that because anyone told me. I knew because, after nearly 8 years of managing the trust, I had memorized the rhythm of those deposits without ever meaning to. My mother always paid her mortgage within hours of the distribution landing. Chloe moved faster, but less carefully. Whatever felt most urgent got hit first. A car payment, a credit card, some last-minute charge she had ignored until it became dramatic enough to matter. The money had moved through their lives so regularly that they no longer seemed to think of it as money at all. It was just there, like power in an outlet, something that worked until the second it didn't. The first half of the day passed in silence. No calls to the office, no emails. No one showing up at the front door demanding answers. Part of me found that more unsettling than if they had reacted right away. It meant they were still in the stage where they thought the problem had to be technical. A bank issue. A processing delay. A clerical mistake. Anything but the truth. By the time I got home that afternoon, the delay had done its work. I set my keys on the counter, slipped off my shoes, and opened the refrigerator with no real appetite. I ended up heating a bowl of leftover soup, mostly because the kitchen felt too quiet without something going on in it. While the microwave hummed, I rinsed out a glass at the sink. That was when I noticed the screen of my phone lighting up on the counter beside me. 12 missed calls. All from my mother. I stood there with the water still running over my hand, looking at the number without touching the phone. Then the screen lit again. 13 missed calls. A text followed almost immediately. Naomi, call me right now. Something's wrong with the bank. I shut off the faucet and dried my hands slowly on a dish towel. Another text came in before I'd even set it down. The trust payment didn't come. And then one more. If this is some kind of mistake, you need to fix it today. No hello. No hesitation. No trace of the woman who had told me, on my birthday, not to contact her anymore. Whatever space she had needed from me had apparently vanished the second her deposit did. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Chloe. What did you do? Not what happened. Not can we talk. Just that. A second message followed. I have things coming out tomorrow. Then a third. Turn it back on. I stared at the words and felt something in me go very still. There it was, not hidden behind politeness, not softened by confusion, just the truth, showing up in broad daylight. My mother thought the system had malfunctioned. Chloe went straight to me. Somewhere under all those years of pretending the money was simply family money, she had always known I was closer to it than she wanted to admit. I still didn't answer. Instead, I opened my voicemail. The first message was from my mother, recorded about 20 minutes earlier. Her voice was tight, breathless in that way it got, when irritation was still trying to disguise itself as panic. Naomi, call me back. The deposit didn't hit, and I already spoke to the bank. They said the transfer was suspended. I don't know what that means, but something is clearly wrong. The second voicemail came less than 10 minutes later. The panic was already thinning. What was underneath it sounded much more familiar. Naomi, this is ridiculous. If there's an issue with the trust, you need to handle it. My mortgage is due. I listened to that one twice. Then I played Chloe's. Naomi, pick up. The venue payment is supposed to clear this week. And if this messes up the engagement party, she cut herself off before the sentence ended. Maybe because she realized what she was saying. Maybe because she didn't. Either way, the message ended in silence and a hard click. I looked down at the call log again. 17 missed calls now. 3 voicemails from my mother. 2 from Chloe. 1 from an unknown number I was almost certain belonged to Chloe, using someone else's phone. And not one of them started with, "I'm sorry." Not one asked how I was. Not one acknowledged the message they had sent the night before. That was the moment the last of my doubt burned off. I wasn't being contacted because I mattered to them. I was being contacted because the money had stopped, and suddenly they could see the shape of what I had been doing all along. Another text from my mother came through. This is family money, Naomi. You do not get to play games with it. Call me. I read it once, then turned the phone face down on the counter. The microwave beeped. I carried my soup to the table, sat down in the quiet kitchen, and let the phone keep vibrating behind me. The phone finally stopped vibrating sometime after I sat down with the soup, and the silence that followed felt oddly heavy, like the kitchen itself was listening. I finished only a few bites before giving up and carrying the bowl to the sink. My mother's last text still lingered in my head. This is family money, Naomi. You do not get to play games with it. That was the part that stayed with me, not the anger, not even the demand, but the instinct underneath it. In her mind, I had disrupted something that belonged to her. Not something I managed. Not something I protected. Something I had no right to interrupt. I had just switched off the light over the stove when my phone rang again. I looked down, expecting my mother's name or Chloe's. Instead, the screen said Ruth Bennett. I blinked at it for a second before answering. Hello? Naomi. Ruth's voice was low and dry, the kind of voice that always sounded like it had already thought things through before calling anyone. You doing anything tomorrow morning? The question threw me. Not before work. Why? Because I'm buying you breakfast. She paused. And because, if I don't get to you first, your mother will get to half the county. I leaned a shoulder against the counter. She's already started, hasn't she? Ruth made a small sound that might have been a laugh, if she'd been the kind of woman who wasted one. 8 o'clock, Miller's Diner. Then she hung up. I stood there for a while with the deadline in my ear. Ruth had always existed at the edge of the family, never fully in, and never fully out. She was technically my mother's cousin, though everyone called her Aunt Ruth because she belonged to that older generation who had earned titles through endurance more than blood. She lived alone in a white clapboard house at the far end of Briar Road, with rose bushes that grew where they pleased, and a porch swing nobody ever seemed to sit in. Ruth came to family events when she felt like it, left early when she didn't, and never explained herself either way. As a child, I thought she was stern. As an adult, I understood she was careful. I barely slept that night, but not for the same reason I had the week before. It wasn't the shock this time. It was anticipation. I knew Ruth hadn't called for small talk. At 7:50 the next morning, I pulled into the cracked lot outside Miller's Diner. The bell over the door gave its usual half-late jangle when I stepped inside. The place smelled like bacon grease, burnt coffee, and toast. The kind of smell that never really leaves old diners, no matter how many times they mop the floors. Ruth was already in the corner booth, of course. Coat folded beside her, white mug in one hand. The little paper sleeve of sweetener on the table torn open but untouched. She looked up as I approached. You look tired, she said. Good morning to you too. That was my good morning. She nudged the menu in my direction. Sit down. I slid into the booth across from her. A waitress came by, and I ordered eggs and toast without really thinking about it. Ruth waited until we were alone again before speaking. Elaine's making calls, she said, stirring her coffee once and setting the spoon down with more precision than necessary. Patty first, then Denise Harper, then Celia Marsh. I nodded slowly. Church circle. Of course, church circle. Ruth lifted her mug. Your mother never did understand the value of a small audience. She likes one large enough to repeat her. I looked out the window toward the gas station across the street, its pumps still empty this early in the morning. What version is she telling? That you're punishing her over a misunderstanding, that you've become cold, that money changed you. Ruth took a sip of coffee. The usual lazy draft. Something in me tightened, but not with surprise. Just recognition. Ruth studied my face for a moment, then said, You think I didn't know? I looked back at her. Know what? That your mother has been taking credit for a life you've been financing. The words landed harder than I expected. Ruth set her mug down and leaned back. After Walter's first stroke, I helped him with the books for almost 2 years. I'm the one who used to balance the rent ledgers when his hand got too shaky by the end of the day. I know how those properties were set up. I know how the trust was meant to work, and I know your mother well enough to know she was never going to tell people the money passed through you first. A memory flickered up so fast it almost felt physical. My mother standing in the church parking lot after service, smiling while someone told her how admirable it was that she had held everything together after the divorce. I had been right beside her holding a tray of leftover sheet cake, and she had just smiled and said, The Lord provides. She had never looked at me once. Ruth must have seen something shift in my face because her own expression changed, just slightly. Elaine can survive hardship, she said. What she can't survive is being seen as dependent. So she rewrote the story, made herself the strong widow, the selfless mother, the woman who kept the family afloat. Her gaze sharpened, and she let you do the actual work without ever stepping into the light. The waitress brought our plates. Ruth thanked her. I didn't touch my fork. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Ruth tore off a corner of toast, set it down again, and met my eyes. Because you've spent years making it easy for her to keep the story clean. She paused. And yesterday, for the first time, you didn't. I looked down at my plate, then back at her. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then Ruth reached for her coffee and said, quieter this time, "About time, Naomi." Ruth's last words stayed with me all the way back to the office. By the time I unlocked the front door of Hayes Property Services, I knew I wasn't going to spend the morning pretending I could focus on routine. The building was cool and dim, still holding on to the early chill. I keyed in the alarm code, switched on the lights, and stood for a moment in the quiet lobby with my bag still on my shoulder. 2 work orders sat clipped on the front desk. A supplier had left a voicemail about the replacement water heater. There were 3 tenant emails waiting, and a roofing estimate I still hadn't approved. Normal things. Manageable things. The kind of problems that stayed exactly what they were. What Ruth had handed me at breakfast was not a problem. It was a direction. I set my bag down, opened my laptop, and pulled up my email. For a minute or two, I tried to work like usual. I answered the supplier, flagged the Madison fixture photos, forwarded the Birch Lane estimate to the plumber. But Ruth's voice kept coming back to me. Your mother rewrote the story. After a while, I stopped pretending I wasn't looking for something. I typed one word into the search bar. Trust. Dozens of old threads came up. Vendor questions, tax documents, Martin's notes, transfer confirmations, budget summaries. I scrolled slowly, my eyes moving over years of ordinary administration, until one subject line caught and held me. Trust. Question. I clicked. The email was 4 years old. My mother's name sat at the top of it, neat and familiar. For a second, I only looked at the screen without reading, as if some part of me already knew what was there and was trying to delay the moment it became real again. Then I read it. Naomi, please don't tell people you manage the trust. It makes it look like I can't take care of my own family. Just keep the money coming and let me handle the rest. I read it twice more. The office was so quiet, I could hear the old printer settling in the next room. 4 years ago, I had accepted that message for the version of love I was used to taking from my mother. I told myself she was embarrassed. I told myself she wanted privacy. I told myself I was doing something kind by agreeing to stay in the background. At the time, it had felt easier to protect her pride than to question why my absence from the story mattered so much to her. Now, after Ruth, after the birthday text, after the missed calls and the demands, and the sudden panic, the second the money stopped, the words looked different. Not softer, not sadder, clearer. This wasn't a daughter trying to preserve her mother's dignity. This was a woman being instructed to stay invisible so someone else could keep wearing credit that didn't belong to her. I sat back slowly in my chair, then leaned forward again and clicked forward. I sent the email to my backup account first. Then I took a screenshot with the full header visible, the date, the time, her address, the subject line. After that, I created a folder on my desktop and named it Trust Records. The name was plain. Deliberately plain. I wasn't collecting pain anymore. I was collecting documentation. I saved the screenshot inside it. Then I opened my phone and pulled up the screenshots I had already taken over the last few days. My mother's birthday text telling me not to contact her anymore. Chloe's reaction underneath it. The missed call log. The follow-up texts about the bank. Chloe's message telling me to turn it back on. One by one, I moved them into the folder too. When I was done, I sat there looking at the screen. The thing about family is that a single moment can almost always be explained away. One cruel sentence can be called stress. One selfish message can be blamed on panic. One silence can be dressed up as distraction. But laid side by side, with dates and timestamps and years between them, those moments begin to lose their excuses. They become evidence. That was what I was staring at now. Not a misunderstanding, not a bad week, not one terrible birthday. A record. For years, my mother had relied on more than the trust itself. She had relied on my cooperation, on my silence, on my willingness to let her version of events stand simply because challenging it felt uglier than enduring it. Ruth had been right. I had made it easy for her to keep the story clean. I looked back at the email one last time. Just keep the money coming, and let me handle the rest. I let out a slow breath and leaned back in my chair. No, I said quietly, to the empty office, to the screen, to 4 years of silence all at once. You handled the story. Then I closed the message, left the folder open on my desktop, and for the first time started thinking less about what my mother had done and more about what I was going to do when she realized I had proof. What my mother did next was an apology. It was escalation. I didn't realize how far she had already pushed things until 2 evenings later, when I stopped at Holloway's Market after work for coffee filters, dish soap, and a carton of eggs. It was the kind of small grocery store where people usually noticed you in friendly ways. Mrs. Patterson at the deli counter always asked whether I wanted my turkey sliced thin. Betty Marsh from church usually waved from somewhere near produce. That night, nobody was rude. It would have been easier if they had been. They were just different. Mrs. Patterson looked up when I came in, then looked back down at her slicer so quickly it felt practiced. In aisle 4, Betty stood beside another woman from church with a box of tea in one hand. They were talking until I turned the corner. By the time I reached for the coffee filters, they had gone quiet. Nothing anyone could be called out for. Nothing obvious. Just that subtle drop in temperature you feel in a small town when a story arrives before you do. I paid, carried the bag out to my car, and sat there for a minute without starting the engine. Through the windshield, I watched people go in and out, under the fading light, heads bent, doors opening and closing, carts rattling over cracked pavement. My mother had always understood towns like ours, better than I ever wanted to. She knew you didn't have to accuse someone directly, if you could get there first with hurt in your voice, and just enough missing detail to let everyone else finish the story for you. By Sunday, I knew I hadn't imagined any of it. After service, Reverend Harper caught me just outside the church doors. He was a kind man in the way people often are when kindness costs them nothing, and deeply uncomfortable in the way they become when it suddenly might. The late morning sun was bright enough to make everyone squint. People moved around us in little clusters toward the parking lot, church clothes flashing pale in the light, the smell of cut grass hanging in the warm air. "Naomi," he said, lowering his voice. "Do you have a minute?" I did not want to, but I nodded. He led me a few steps away toward the hedges, beside the sidewalk, and folded his hands in front of him, then unfolded them. "Your mother came to speak with me this week." I waited. "She's very upset," he said. "She told me there's been a sudden issue involving family support, that things were cut off without warning. She said she doesn't understand why it's gone this far." There it was. Not the birthday text. Not the part where she told me not to contact her anymore. Not Chloe's reaction to it. None of the truth that would have made her version harder to hold. Just a softer story with the sharp edges filed off. "With respect, Reverend," I said, keeping my voice even. "My family's financial arrangements are private. I'm handling them responsibly, and that's all I'm going to say." He nodded too quickly, relieved to be given an exit. "Of course, I just thought you should know that people are talking." "They usually are," I said. I walked to my car with my jaw tight and my hands cold. By then, I should have known it wouldn't stay in whispers. It didn't. On Tuesday night, Chloe posted on Facebook. I didn't see it first. Claire sent me screenshots with a message that read, "Saw this. Keep it before she deletes it." The post never used my name, but it didn't have to. Some people would rather watch their own family suffer than let go of control. I've tried reaching out. I've tried being patient. Nothing matters more to some people than power. Prayers appreciated. By the time Claire captured it, the post already had dozens of reactions and a flood of comments. "So sorry you're going through this. Family shouldn't treat family like that. Praying for you and your mama. Money changes people." I sat at my kitchen table and read the screenshots once. Then I opened the folder on my laptop. Part 8 had been about preserving what was true inside the family. This was different. This was public. Public lies, public sympathy, public damage. I saved everything. The post, the comments, the timestamp, Chloe's profile picture in the corner. Then I called Martin. "They've taken it online now," I said when he answered. "Not by name, but everyone knows." "Good," he said. I blinked. "Good? Good that you have screenshots," he said. "Keep all of it. Don't respond. Let them talk. You keep the record." I looked at the glowing screen on the table in front of me. "That's what I'm doing." "I know," he said. "Stay with that." After we hung up, I sat there in the quiet kitchen with the screenshots open and the evidence folder still on my screen. My mother had moved the fight out of the family and into the town because she thought public pressure would do what guilt no longer could. She thought shame would push me back into place, back into silence, back into the role that kept her version of the story intact. But by then, I wasn't scared of gossip. What unsettled me was something else. The more desperate she became to control the story, the more likely she was to drag the truth out behind her without even realizing it. That truth came out 12 days later, at Chloe's engagement party. The event was set for a Saturday night at Silver Oak House, a restored riverfront venue with white columns, string lights in the courtyard, and the kind of polished Southern charm people in town like to photograph and pretend they could afford more often than they actually could. Chloe had been planning it for months. There were custom invitations, a florist from 2 counties over, a 3-tier cake with sugared roses, and a guest list just big enough to feel impressive without looking desperate. 90 people, if the RSVP sheet Claire sent me was accurate. I wasn't invited. That part didn't surprise me. What mattered was that the final venue payment had never gone through. I had notified Silver Oak in writing the week before that the Carter Trust would not be authorizing any event-related charges. The manager, a careful woman named Denise Hollowell, had confirmed receipt of my email and thanked me for clarifying the account status. No threats, no drama, just clean administration. Money owed was money owed. Without payment, service could be halted at management's discretion. Chloe and my mother either didn't believe that, or they believed the world would bend around them the way it always had before. By 7:30 that evening, I was home in leggings and a loose sweater, sitting on my couch with a mug of tea and a book open on my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in nearly 20 minutes. My phone lit up with a text from Claire. "I'm here. It's packed. Your mother looks like she borrowed dignity and sprayed perfume on it." Despite myself, I let out a short laugh. A second message came in. "Chloe's in white, not bridal white. I'm definitely still the center of the room, white." I set the book aside and waited. At 8:06, Claire texted again. "Speech time. Elaine standing up." I could almost see it. My mother with one hand around a wine glass, the other pressed lightly to her chest, as if gratitude were something fragile and holy. I imagined Chloe beside her, chin lifted, ring angled toward the nearest light. Derek doing that polite half-smile he wore when he wanted to look agreeable without committing to joy. At 8:17, my phone rang. "Claire." I answered on the first buzz. "What happened?" For a second, all I heard was noise voices, music cutting off, something metallic clattering in the background. Then Claire's voice came through, pitched low and fast. "The venue manager just pulled your mom and Chloe into the side hall." My grip tightened on the phone. "Why?" "Because the final payment still isn't there." A beat. "Naomi, I think they genuinely thought it would somehow go through tonight." I stood up without realizing I was doing it. "What's happening now?" Claire shifted, and I could hear the room through her movement. The confused dip in conversation, chairs scraping, the change in the air when people know something is wrong but haven't been told what yet. "Your mother's arguing," she said. "I can't hear all of it, but I heard your name." A knot pulled tight under my ribs. Not fear, anticipation. Then Claire inhaled sharply. "Oh," she said. "What?" "They're coming back in." I paced to the window and stopped there, staring at my own reflection in the glass while I listened. At first it was only a blur of sound, then a woman's voice, my mother's, trying and failing to stay composed. "There's been a misunderstanding with the account." A few murmurs followed. Someone asked if everything was all right. And then Chloe, too loud, too sharp, too panicked to keep pretending. "It's not a misunderstanding," she snapped. Naomi froze the trust. Silence. Not the soft kind, not the polite kind. The kind that lands on a room all at once and makes every fork, every breath, every shifting chair suddenly loud. Through the phone, I heard Claire suck in a breath. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Mrs. Dalton just asked if you're the one who controls the trust." My mother must have tried to answer, because Claire kept going, voice barely above a whisper now. "She's stalling. She's saying it's complicated." Another voice in the background, older, female, clear enough that even over the phone I could hear the edge of it. "It doesn't sound complicated," the woman said. "It sounds like Naomi's been paying for all this." Something in me went completely still. Claire moved again, probably turning, probably tracking faces. "People are looking at your mom like they've never seen her before," she murmured. "Derek looks sick. Chloe's crying now, but angry crying. Not sorry crying." Then came the final sound, a chair pushed back hard, followed by the unmistakable ripple of a room beginning to break apart. Conversations dropping, guests gathering purses. The first people deciding they would rather leave than be trapped inside someone else's humiliation. Claire exhaled into the phone. "It's over," she said. I stood in the dark reflection of my own window, phone against my ear, and felt the full weight of it settle. My mother had dragged the fight into public. Public, it turned out, was where her story died. Claire called back 20 minutes later, after she had made it out to the parking lot. This time, the noise behind her was different. Car doors slamming, gravel under heels. Voices lowered into that sharp, excited register people use when they know they've just witnessed something they'll be repeating for weeks. "You still there?" she asked. "I'm here." She let out a breath. Half the room emptied in under 10 minutes. Nobody wanted to be the last person pretending it was still a party. I sat back down slowly on the couch, though my tea had gone cold, and the book beside me now looked like it belonged to someone else's evening. What happened after Chloe said it? "Your mom tried to recover." Claire snorted softly. "You know that voice she gets when she thinks being calmer than everyone else will make her right? She used that, said there had been a misunderstanding about the trust, that emotions were high, that family matters were being handled privately." A pause. The problem was, nobody believed her anymore. I closed my eyes for a second. "Mrs. Dalton kept asking questions," Claire continued. "Then Ruth was there. Oh, she was there." I could hear the grim satisfaction in Claire's voice. "And once she stood up, it was done. She said, plain as day, that your grandfather structured the trust the way he did for a reason, and that everybody in that room ought to be asking why your mother had let the town believe she was self-sufficient while you were carrying the financial load." I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, one hand pressed against my forehead. Claire kept going. "Derek looked like he'd been hit with a board. He kept asking Chloe, 'What does that mean?' Froze the trust. 'What does that mean?' And Chloe just kept crying and saying you were ruining her life." "Of course she did." "Then Silver Oak's manager came back over," Claire said. "Quietly, very professionally, and told them the event would need to conclude if the balance couldn't be settled immediately. Your mother said something about wiring the money Monday. The manager said no. A lot of people had already started leaving by then anyway. I pictured it too easily. Centerpieces still perfect. Cake untouched or half-cut. White tablecloths and melting ice, and my mother standing in the middle of all of it trying to hold together a version of herself that had already split open. "Did anyone say anything to Chloe?" I asked. A few people tried, mostly the older women, the sympathetic tilt of the head crowd. Claire hesitated. But the energy had changed. It wasn't pity the way she wanted. It was realization. That word stayed with me after we hung up. Not victory, not revenge. Realization. By Monday morning, the whole town knew some version of what had happened. Not all of it. Not the birthday text. Not the years of silence and small humiliations, and all the ways I had let myself be edited out of my own life. But enough. Enough that when I stopped at the post office, Mrs. Dalton touched my forearm and said, very quietly, "Your grandfather would have wanted someone sensible in charge." Enough that Betty Marsh, who had avoided my eyes at the market just days earlier, suddenly found the cereal display fascinating when she saw me in line at Holloway's. Enough that silence had changed sides. At 9:30, I was in Martin Bell's office. He had the trust document open before I even sat down, his reading glasses low on his nose, a yellow tab marking the distributions section. Sunlight from the front window fell across the wood grain of his desk, catching the dust in the air. He looked up at me and nodded once, as if to say he already knew why I was there. "I want to restructure the distributions," I said. He folded his hands. "All right. Not cut them off permanently." I surprised myself with how steady that sounded. "But no more open access. No more assumption that this is a personal checking account." Martin nodded slowly. "What are you thinking?" I had gone over it twice in my head before I came. Probably 10 times, if I was being honest. 1,200 a month for my mother. 1,000 for Chloe. Essential expenses only. Housing, utilities, groceries, insurance. No discretionary draws without documentation. Receipts required. If they want anything outside that, they submit the request in writing and we review it. Martin picked up his pen and started writing. "Temporary or indefinite?" he asked. "Indefinite." He glanced up. "I'm done funding comfort that gets repaid with contempt," I said. "If they want more than survival, they can work for it the way everyone else does." For the first time that morning, something that almost looked like approval passed across his face. "We can draft the notice today," he said. "I want certified mail." "Of course." I sat back in the chair and looked past him toward the shelves lined with binders and estate files and decades of other families trying, and failing, to keep money from exposing what was already wrong with them. There was one more thing. "The charitable provision," I said. Martin's brows lifted slightly. "You want to activate it?" I nodded. My grandfather always intended part of the trust to go somewhere useful. A scholarship, trade school, or community college. Local kids. He made another note. And there it was. All at once, the shift I hadn't known I'd been walking toward. Not just taking something away, deciding what deserved to remain. When I left his office an hour later, the letters were already being prepared. For the first time in years, the trust was no longer supporting the loudest people in my family. It was starting to reflect the man who built it. It was strange how ordinary life looked after something inside it had finally broken for good. By the end of November, the letters Martin sent had done their work. My mother signed for hers at 9:12 on a Tuesday morning. Chloe signed for hers just after lunch. From that day forward, the trust changed shape. No more automatic comfort. No more soft, invisible stream of money pouring into lives that treated gratitude like an insult. My mother's monthly support dropped to 1,200. Chloe's dropped to 1,000. Receipts required. Requests in writing. No exceptions for shopping, parties, dresses, or whatever fresh emergency appeared, because they had mistaken indulgence for stability. The first call came from my mother, before the ink on the certified slip was probably even dry. "You can't do this," she snapped the second I picked up. "I am your mother." I stood at my kitchen counter, one hand around a mug of coffee gone lukewarm. "I already did it." Her silence lasted half a breath. Then came the fury. The old familiar rhythm of it. How dare I? What would people think? How was she supposed to live? Hadn't she sacrificed enough? Hadn't she given me everything? I listened until she ran out of momentum. Then I said, quietly, "If 1,200 isn't enough, then maybe for the first time in your life, you'll have to build a life you can actually afford." She hung up on me. Chloe never called. She sent 3 texts instead, each worse than the last. First came outrage, then tears, then blame. By the final message, she was saying Derek had postponed the wedding, that people were humiliating her, that I had destroyed the best part of her life because I couldn't stand to see her happy. I read all 3, then set the phone down, and went back to rinsing dishes. It was almost funny, in a bleak kind of way. Even then, even after everything had collapsed in public, neither of them could imagine a version of the story where their own choices had brought them here. The scholarship announcement ran in the Caldwell County paper 2 weeks later. The Walter Hayes Community Scholarship, open to local seniors headed for trade school or community college. $30,000 a year from the trust, the same trust that had once paid for Chloe's dress fittings and my mother's brunches and all the polished little lies that made them look established. When I saw the notice in print, my throat tightened in a way I hadn't expected. Not from grief, not from triumph, from recognition. For the first time in years, the money was doing something clean. People in town began looking at me differently after that. Not warmly, not all at once, but clearly. Mrs. Dalton stopped me outside church one Sunday and squeezed my hand. Ruth came by with a pie she claimed she had baked too much of, though we both knew she had made it on purpose. Claire still texted me gossip when she heard it, but now there was laughter mixed into it. Less poison in the air, less room for my mother's version to keep breathing. Then, one cold evening in early December, a letter arrived. My mother's stationery. Lavender border. Her initials pressed into the corner. I knew before I opened it that it wouldn't say what I needed it to say. I was right. Naomi, I'm sorry things became so public. I'm sorry you felt hurt, but you didn't have to embarrass me in front of everyone. If you restore the support to what it was, maybe we can start healing as a family. I read it once, then again, slower. Not one line about my birthday. Not one line about telling me not to contact her. Not one line about years of taking and hiding and letting me disappear so she could stay admired. She was sorry for the audience. Sorry for the consequences. Sorry the story no longer obeyed her. Nothing more. I folded the letter carefully and slid it into the drawer beside the stove. Outside, the wind pushed dry leaves down the sidewalk. Inside, my kitchen was warm, the light above the table casting that same soft circle it always did at night. On the wall hung 2 photographs, my grandfather in front of the duplex, and one Claire had taken of me laughing at Ruth's porch in autumn, coffee in my hand, head tipped back, looking like someone no longer waiting to be chosen. That was the part my mother would never understand. I had spent years thinking love meant enduring whatever people were willing to do to me, so long as I could still call them family after. But peace bought with erasure isn't peace. It's just a quieter kind of loneliness. My family cut me out on my birthday. What they lost wasn't just access to the money. It was access to the version of me that would keep paying to be unloved. When people only value your silence, your sacrifice, or what you can provide, that is not love, it is dependence. Real love sees you, respects you, and remembers your worth even when you say no. Protecting your peace is not cruelty. Sometimes, the healthiest boundary is the one that finally teaches others your value.